More than 500 million years ago, complex life was already established across Earth's oceans. It did not resemble anything that exists today. Body plans appeared that do not map onto modern animals, even at a basic structural level. Some organisms moved using rows of lateral flaps, producing steady propulsion without fins. Others carried spines arranged along soft bodies with no clear front or back. There were forms with multiple eyes, but no consistent face. Classification became unstable. Fossils recovered from this period often arrived as fragments that did not align. Early reconstructions placed limbs where heads should be and heads where tails might have been. In several cases, entire organisms were assembled incorrectly for years before revision. Predation had already begun to scale. One group developed circular mouth structures composed of overlapping plates, capable of processing soft-bodied prey without teeth. Another evolved grasping appendages that extended forward, separate from the main body. These systems operated without clear parallels in later evolution. For millions of years, these organisms were not rare. They occupied wide marine environments and formed stable ecosystems. Their designs persisted long enough to shape food webs, not just appear briefly. Then they disappear. Entire groups leave no continuation. The fossil record shows intervals where diverse forms are present, followed by layers where they are absent without replacement. Some extinction events removed most life in the ocean, exceeding later losses associated with dinosaurs. Recovery did not restore what was lost, but what determined which body plans continued and which ended without descendants? Why do so many of these organisms resist clear classification even after decades of study? Tonight, we step back into those long forgotten worlds to meet the strange creatures that lived before the dinosaurs and explore the mystery of how so many of them simply vanished. Before we go any further, are you listening to this to help you fall asleep, or did curiosity just bring you here tonight? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you love these calm journeys into Earth's deep past, hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Now, let's go meet these alien wonders from 500 million years ago. Time stretches backward across an expanse so vast that familiar shapes begin to dissolve, leaving behind a planet still assembling its identity in slow, deliberate phases. Hundreds of millions of years before the first dinosaurs would step onto land, Earth existed in states that feel distant, not only in time, but in structure, rhythm, and possibility. The surface was dominated by oceans that seemed to have no clear boundary, their waters spreading across most of the globe, holding within them the earliest sustained experiments of complex life. Across this long unfolding, the planet moved through intervals now known as the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and Permian periods. Each phase carried its own subtle rearrangements, not only of life, but of land and atmosphere. Continents did not rest where they do now. Instead, they gathered, separated, and gathered again, forming vast supercontinents that shifted like slow-moving plates of memory. Shorelines were unfamiliar, often fragmented or immense, shaping currents that guided the distribution of life in ways that no longer exist. The air itself carried a different composition. Oxygen levels, once far lower than those of the present, gradually rose over immense spans of time. This quiet transformation altered what life could sustain, how energy moved through bodies, and how ecosystems could expand in complexity. The change did not arrive as a sudden shift, but as a steady accumulation, an invisible adjustment that slowly widened the boundaries of what was possible. For much of this era, life remained almost entirely within the oceans. There were no birds crossing the sky, no mammals moving across land, no flowering plants adding color to the surface. The continents, though present, were largely silent, shaped more by wind and water than by living systems. Beneath the waves, however, Something intricate was taking form. Early organisms, once simple and limited, began to interact in layered ways, building the foundations of food webs that would grow increasingly complex. Energy began to flow through these systems with greater structure. Some organisms absorbed nutrients directly from their surroundings, while others fed upon them, introducing the earliest dynamics of consumption and survival. Predation, still in its infancy, began to influence form and behavior. Defensive structures emerged gradually, not as deliberate designs, but as outcomes shaped by countless interactions over time. Each adjustment carried forward, reinforcing patterns that allowed certain forms to persist, while others faded quietly. As these relationships deepened, ecosystems gained a kind of internal balance, though never fixed or permanent. Shifts in environment, chemistry, and geography continued to reshape them, ensuring that stability was always temporary. Life responded not with intention, but with variation, filling available spaces in ways that reflected both opportunity and constraint. The planet in this distant span was not empty or waiting, but already active, already complex, already engaged in processes that would echo far into the future. The absence of familiar life does not suggest simplicity, but rather a different kind of richness, one built from forms and interactions that no longer persist. Beneath the surface of those ancient oceans, the groundwork of all later ecosystems was quietly assembling, layer by layer, long before the world would resemble anything now recognized. A subtle acceleration begins to ripple through the living fabric of the oceans, not as a single event, but as a widening cascade of change that gathers momentum over time. Around 540 million years ago, the pace of biological development shifts in a way that becomes visible even across the immense distance of deep time. Layers of rock begin to preserve a record unlike anything that came before, revealing a sudden richness in form, structure, and interaction. Within these ancient sediments, bodies appear that carry a new level of organization. Shapes become more defined, symmetry emerges with greater consistency, and internal structures begin to guide movement and function. Where earlier life had been simple and often indistinct, these new organisms display clear outlines, with segments, appendages, and surfaces that suggest specific roles. It is not a quiet expansion, but a broad unfolding of possibilities, as if life has found new ways to explore its own potential. Among these changes, the first true predators begin to move through the water with purpose. Their presence introduces a new dynamic, one that reshapes the behavior and form of other organisms around them. Movement becomes more deliberate, more responsive. The act of being consumed becomes a pressure that shapes bodies over generations, encouraging adaptations that offer protection, escape, or concealment. This interplay, subtle at first, begins to ripple outward, influencing entire communities. In response, many organisms develop outer coverings that alter how they interact with their environment. Hard shells and exoskeletons begin to appear, providing both support and defense. These structures do more than protect, they allow for new forms of movement and stability, enabling creatures to anchor themselves, burrow, or navigate the seafloor with greater control. The mineralization of these arcane layers also leaves behind clearer traces, preserving their presence in ways that softer bodies rarely could before. What emerges during this span is not a single path of development, but a wide array of experimental designs. Bodies take on configurations that seem unfamiliar, even when viewed with modern understanding. Limbs appear in unexpected arrangements, sensory structures develop in varied forms, and feeding mechanisms diversify in ways that suggest a constant probing of what might be viable. Many of these designs persist only briefly in the geological record, while others continue long enough to shape the ecosystems around them. The diversity becomes so pronounced that entire categories of body plans arise, some bearing no resemblance to anything that would follow in later eras. These forms do not represent incomplete steps toward modern animals, but complete and functional organisms in their own right, adapted to the conditions of their time. Their existence reflects a period when the boundaries of biological design were still wide, not yet narrowed by the long processes that would later favor certain structures over others. As this expansion continues, ecosystems grow more layered and interconnected. Organisms occupy different positions within emerging food webs, interacting in ways that create a sense of balance, though always shifting, always responsive to change. The seafloor becomes a place of activity, marked by trails, burrows, and the subtle rearrangement of sediment, each trace a quiet indication of life moving, feeding, and adapting. Through this interval, the record left behind suggests not chaos, but an intricate unfolding where variation and selection move together, shaping a world that is at once unfamiliar and foundational. The forms that arise during this time set the stage for all that follows, even as many of them fade, leaving only impressions in stone, reminders of a moment when life expanded its reach in ways that would never be repeated in quite the same way again. It first appears not as a complete creature, but as fragments separated by time and interpretation, scattered across layers of ancient stone. For years, these pieces seemed unrelated, each one assigned to a different organism, each one studied in isolation. A curved appendage was thought to belong to one species, a circular structure to another, and a segmented body to something else entirely. Only much later did these fragments begin to align, revealing a single form that had once moved with quiet authority through early oceans. Anomalocaris emerges from this reconstruction as one of the largest predators of its time, its presence defined not by bulk alone, but by the way its body was arranged for movement and control. Its elongated form was lined with a series of flexible flaps, each one undulating in sequence, allowing it to glide through the water with a smooth, wave-like motion. This method of propulsion created a sense of continuity along its body, as if it were less a collection of parts and more a single flowing structure responding to its surroundings. At the front, two large appendages extended forward, jointed and lined with spines that curved inward. These limbs did not strike with sudden force, but closed with measured precision, guiding smaller organisms toward its center. Their movement suggests coordination rather than randomness, a controlled action shaped by repeated interaction with prey. Between them sat a circular mouth composed not of teeth in the familiar sense, but of rigid plates arranged in a ring. These plates could open and close, pressing inward in a motion that suggests both grasping and processing, a mechanism unlike anything that persists today. Fossil evidence preserves more than just the outline of its body. Certain specimens show patterns that hint at feeding behavior, with damaged shells and disturbed sediment suggesting encounters between predator and prey. These traces, subtle yet consistent, offer a glimpse into interactions that once unfolded beneath ancient waters. They indicate not only that Anomalocaris fed on other organisms, but that it influenced the structure of its environment, shaping the distribution and behavior of those around it. The early misunderstanding of its anatomy reflects how unfamiliar such a creature is when viewed through a modern lens. Each fragment, when first discovered, was interpreted according to known forms, fitted into categories that could not fully contain it. Only through the gradual accumulation of discoveries did its true structure become apparent, requiring a shift in perspective, a willingness to accept that early life operated under different principles of design. In its complete form, Anomalocaris represents more than a single species. It embodies a stage in the history of life when predation began to take on new complexity, when movement, perception, and feeding mechanisms became more integrated. Its body does not resemble a transitional step toward later animals, but a fully realized configuration suited to its time, effective within the conditions that shaped it. As it moved through its environment, it carried with it the influence of a predator, altering the rhythm of surrounding life in ways that would echo beyond its own existence. Though it would not persist into later ages, its presence marks a moment when the balance of ecosystems began to shift, guided by interactions that would continue to evolve long after its form had vanished, leaving only impressions that required patience to understand. In certain layers of ancient stone, there are forms that seem to resist interpretation, their shapes preserved with enough clarity to be seen, yet arranged in ways that feel disconnected from any familiar pattern. Hallucigenia emerges from these impressions as a creature whose appearance unsettled early attempts at understanding, not through size or dominance, but through a structure that defied expectation at nearly every point along its body. Its form stretches outward in a narrow, elongated line, resembling a soft-bodied organism supported by a series of rigid spines rising from one side. Beneath this row of spines, slender appendages extend downward, flexible and evenly spaced, giving the impression of a creature suspended between stability and motion. These limbs, delicate in comparison to the hardened structures above them, appear suited for careful contact with the seafloor, suggesting a slow and deliberate way of moving through its environment. When the first fossils were studied, the arrangement of these features led to a reconstruction that placed the spines downward, as if they were walking supports, and the softer appendages upward, drifting without purpose. In this interpretation, the creature seemed almost impossible, a body balanced precariously on rigid points, with no clear way to move or interact with its surroundings. The absence of a recognizable head or defined face added to this uncertainty, leaving no obvious direction of orientation, no clear indication of where perception or feeding might occur. As additional specimens were discovered and examined with greater detail, subtle consistencies began to emerge. The positioning of the limbs, the alignment of the spines, and the texture of the preserved body suggested a reversal of the earlier interpretation. The spines, once thought to support the organism, were instead protective structures rising above it, while the softer appendages below served as its means of contact and movement. This shift, though simple in concept, transformed the entire understanding of how hallucigenia existed. Further analysis revealed traces of a small, understated head at one end of the body, lacking the prominent features that might guide immediate recognition. There were no large eyes preserved, no obvious sensory organs that could be easily identified, only a subtle tapering that indicated direction. This minimal expression of a head structure contributed to the difficulty in placing the organism within known categories, as it offered few familiar cues for comparison. The corrected reconstruction presents a creature that moves with quiet precision, its many limbs coordinating to support a steady progression across the substrate, while the spines above create a barrier against potential threats. Its design suggests an existence shaped by interactions that required both flexibility and defense, though not in the dramatic sense seen in later organisms. Instead, it reflects a balance achieved within the specific conditions of its time. Hallucigenia does not stand as an isolated curiosity, but as a reminder of how early life explored forms that do not persist into the present. Its initial misinterpretation reflects the challenge of viewing such organisms through frameworks built on modern examples. Only by setting aside those expectations could its structure be understood in a way that aligns with the evidence left behind. In this way, it carries a quiet significance, not through dominance or scale, but through the clarity it brings to the limits of recognition, showing that the language of early life was broader than the patterns that remain, and that some forms can only be understood once those patterns are allowed to loosen and expand. There are moments in the fossil record where structure seems to drift beyond expectation, forming bodies that do not align with any familiar arrangement, as if perception itself must adjust before understanding can begin. Opabinia rests within this space, a small marine organism whose form appears assembled from elements that rarely coexist, each feature contributing to a design that feels both precise and unfamiliar. Its body extends in a gentle sequence of segments, tapering toward the rear, with lateral flaps that suggest a controlled movement through the surrounding water. These flaps do not dominate its presence, yet they provide a steady rhythm to its motion, allowing it to navigate its environment without abrupt shifts. Along the upper surface, a soft ridge outlines the body's length, giving it a subtle definition against the background of ancient seas. What draws immediate attention, however, is the arrangement at its front. Five eyes rise from its head, positioned in a way that expands its field of awareness beyond the constraints seen in most later organisms. These eyes are not clustered tightly together, but spaced to offer overlapping perspectives, forming a broad visual range that likely allowed it to detect movement from multiple directions. This configuration suggests a sensory system attuned not to focus, but to coverage, a way of perceiving the environment as a continuous field rather than a narrow line of sight. Extending forward from beneath these eyes is a long, flexible appendage, often described as a proboscis. It curves outward and downward, ending in a small grasping structure capable of precise movement. This appendage appears to have functioned as a feeding tool, reaching into the sediment or water column to capture particles or small organisms. Its flexibility indicates a level of control that complements the wide visual input provided by the eyes above, creating a coordinated system of perception and action. The mouth itself is positioned beneath this structure, facing backward, a detail that further separates Opabinia from more familiar anatomical patterns. Food gathered by the proboscis would be guided toward this opening, suggesting a feeding process that unfolds in stages, each movement contributing to a smooth transfer from capture to consumption. This arrangement, though unusual, reflects a functional coherence shaped by the conditions in which it existed. In its entirety, Opabinia presents a body plan that does not resemble a transitional form leading toward modern animals, but rather a complete and stable configuration suited to its own ecological role. Its features do not appear excessive or arbitrary when considered together, but integrated in a way that supports its movement, feeding, and interaction with its surroundings. The unfamiliarity arises not from inefficiency, but from difference, from a set of solutions that diverge from those that would later become more common. The presence of such a creature highlights the breadth of sensory and structural variation that existed during this period. Vision, in this context, was not confined to a single arrangement, but explored through multiple configurations, each offering distinct advantages within specific environments. Opabinia's five eyes stand as a reflection of this exploration, an indication that perception itself was subject to experimentation, shaped by the same processes that guided the rest of its form. As it moved quietly through its world, gathering and responding, it carried within its structure a reminder that early life did not follow a single path, but unfolded through a wide spectrum of possibilities, many of which would leave no direct continuation, existing only as preserved impressions that continue to broaden the understanding of what life once was. Across vast spans of ancient seabeds, a repeating pattern settles into the stone, a quiet imprint of bodies that once moved in great numbers, leaving behind a record not of rarity, but of persistence. Trilobites emerge within this record as one of the most enduring groups of early animals, their presence stretching across immense intervals of time, adapting to shifting conditions while maintaining a recognizable form. Their bodies are divided into three distinct lobes, a structure that gives them both their name and their characteristic outline. This segmentation extends from head to tail, creating a balanced form that allows for flexibility without losing stability. The outer surface is composed of a hard exoskeleton, mineralized in a way that both protected the organism and ensured its preservation long after its life had ended. As a result, trilobites remain among the most commonly found fossils, their forms captured in fine detail across countless layers of sediment. Within this broad consistency, variation unfolds. Trilobites appear in a wide range of shapes and sizes, some small and delicate, others larger, with more pronounced features. Their exoskeletons display ridges, spines, and smooth curves, each variation reflecting adaptations to different environments and modes of life. Some species moved across open seabeds, while others navigated more complex terrains, their forms subtly adjusted to suit their surroundings. Their ability to enroll, curling their bodies into compact, protective shapes, reveals a simple yet effective response to potential threats. In this position, the softer underside is shielded by the hardened exterior, creating a temporary barrier against harm. This movement, controlled and reversible, suggests a level of coordination that aligns with the demands of a changing environment, where moments of exposure could be reduced through quick adjustment. At the front of the body, compound eyes extend outward, composed of numerous individual lenses arranged in a precise pattern. These eyes provided a structured way of perceiving light and movement, allowing trilobites to navigate their surroundings with a degree of awareness suited to their ecological roles. The construction of these visual systems, preserved in fossil form, indicates a level of complexity that reflects the gradual refinement of sensory structures over time. Through countless generations, trilobites occupied a range of positions within their ecosystems, participating in the flow of energy and interaction that defined early marine life. Their persistence does not suggest uniformity, but rather an ongoing ability to adjust within certain boundaries, maintaining a core structure while accommodating variation at the edges. This balance allowed them to remain present through periods of change that saw other forms rise and fall. Yet even this long continuity did not extend indefinitely. Over time, the conditions that had once supported their success shifted in ways that could no longer sustain them. Their disappearance does not occur as a sudden absence in all places at once, but as a gradual fading across the record, a reduction in presence that eventually leads to silence. What remains is a vast collection of preserved forms, each one a quiet record of a life once lived, together forming a pattern that speaks of endurance within the limits set by a changing world. Trilobites, in their long history, illustrate how success in one era does not guarantee continuation into the next, and how even the most persistent forms are shaped and eventually concluded by forces that extend beyond their own design. Movement begins to organize itself into patterns that repeat, not in the motion of a single organism, but across entire communities, as if the ocean itself is learning to circulate energy through living forms. What had once been a collection of independent lives starts to align into relationships, subtle at first, then gradually more defined, forming the earliest structures of what can be recognized as ecosystems. At the foundation of these systems, small organisms draw sustenance directly from their surroundings, converting available resources into forms that can be carried forward. Their presence establishes a quiet baseline, a steady input that supports the layers above them. As other organisms feed upon these primary forms, a chain begins to take shape, each link dependent on those below, each interaction contributing to a larger flow that moves through the water and across the sea floor. With the emergence of more active hunters, these connections deepen. Predators move with increasing coordination, guided by sensory systems that allow them to detect and pursue other organisms. Their presence introduces a selective pressure that reshapes behavior and structure, encouraging prey to adapt in ways that reduce vulnerability. Movement becomes more varied, some forms adopting speed, others relying on stillness or concealment, each strategy reflecting a response to the same underlying tension. In turn, bodies begin to change. Surfaces harden, forming protective layers that can resist damage. Spines extend outward, altering the outline of an organism, making it more difficult to grasp or consume. These features do not arise as isolated traits, but as part of a broader pattern where survival is linked to the ability to endure repeated encounters. Over time, such adaptations become more refined, their presence woven into the structure of entire groups. Competition grows as these interactions intensify. Organisms no longer exist in relative isolation, but within networks where resources are shared, contested, and redistributed. The availability of food, space, and stability becomes uneven, leading to subtle shifts in distribution. Some forms become more specialized, occupying narrow roles that allow them to thrive under specific conditions, while others maintain broader tolerances, able to persist across a wider range of environments. This diversification does not follow a single direction, but expands outward, creating a layered system in which multiple strategies coexist. Burrowing organisms alter the sediment, affecting the conditions experienced by others. Filter feeders draw particles from the water, influencing clarity and nutrient flow. Predators shape the abundance of prey, indirectly guiding the structure of the entire community. Each action, though small in isolation, contributes to a network of cause and effect that extends far beyond any single organism. As these systems become more intricate, stability emerges, not as a fixed state, but as a balance maintained through constant adjustment. Changes in one part of the network ripple outward, prompting responses that restore or redefine equilibrium. This dynamic quality allows ecosystems to persist through gradual shifts, even as individual species rise and fall within them. Within this evolving structure, life begins to reflect not only its immediate surroundings, but its position within a broader web of interactions. Form, behavior, and function become increasingly interconnected, shaped by the presence of others as much as by the environment itself. The ocean, once a setting for isolated existence, becomes a space of continuous exchange where every movement, every adaptation, contributes to a system that grows in depth and complexity with each passing interval. At the margins where water loosens its hold on the surface, a subtle transformation begins, unfolding along edges that are neither fully ocean nor fully land. These transitional zones, shaped by tides and exposure, become the first settings where life extends beyond its long residence beneath the surface. What begins here is not a sudden departure, but a gradual reaching outward. as certain forms begin to tolerate conditions that shift between immersion and air. Early plants are among the first to establish a presence in these boundary regions. Their structures remain simple, lacking the complexity seen in later vegetation, yet they possess the ability to anchor themselves to damp substrates, drawing in moisture while enduring periodic dryness. Their growth spreads in low, clustered forms, covering sections of shoreline with a thin layer of living material. In doing so, they begin to alter the surface itself, stabilizing sediments and creating small pockets where conditions become more consistent. As these plant-like organisms extend their reach, they form the foundation for new interactions. The presence of anchored growth introduces a degree of permanence to environments that were once defined by constant change. Organic material accumulates, breaking down and enriching the surface, allowing for a gradual shift in the composition of the ground. What had been bare and shifting begins to hold structure, providing a basis upon which other forms can begin to exist. Among the first animals to follow this transition are arthropods, their bodies already adapted to navigating solid surfaces within aquatic settings. Their segmented forms and jointed limbs allow them to move across uneven terrain, making them well suited to explore these emerging environments. At first, their movements remain closely tied to moisture, rarely venturing far from areas where water remains accessible. Over time, however, some begin to extend their range, adapting to conditions that require greater independence from constant immersion. These early terrestrial excursions are tentative, marked by short forays and limited expansion. The air presents challenges not encountered in water, including the need to retain moisture and support the body without buoyancy. In response, subtle adjustments begin to take shape. External coverings provide protection against desiccation, while internal systems gradually accommodate the demands of a new medium. Each step forward reflects a balance between constraint and adaptation, a process unfolding across countless generations. Along shorelines, simple ecosystems begin to form, composed of plants, arthropods, and the interactions that connect them. Energy flows through these systems in modest but stable patterns, with plant material supporting small communities of organisms that feed, move, and reproduce within this narrow band. The scale remains limited, yet the significance lies in the shift itself, the extension of life into a realm that had previously remained unoccupied. As time continues, these boundary ecosystems expand, inching further inland as conditions allow. The progression is neither uniform nor uninterrupted, shaped by variations in climate, geography, and available resources. Some regions support greater expansion, while others remain constrained, yet the overall movement continues, guided by the same gradual processes that have shaped life from its earliest stages. In this quiet transition, the surface of the planet begins to change in a fundamental way. Land, once largely devoid of living systems, starts to carry the imprint of life, subtle at first, then increasingly defined. The movement from water to land does not replace the importance of the oceans, but adds a new dimension, extending the reach of life into spaces that will, over time, support an ever-growing diversity of forms, each one tracing its origin back to these first, careful steps beyond the edge. In waters where light filtered through shifting layers of sediment and suspended particles, a different kind of presence moved with measured control, neither drifting nor gliding, but advancing with a deliberate, grounded motion that suggested both strength and restraint. Eurypterids, often called sea scorpions, occupied these environments with a form that combined the segmented logic of arthropods with proportions that set them apart from nearly all others of their kind. Their bodies extended in elongated sections, each segment contributing to a structure that balanced flexibility with firmness. At the front, broad appendages projected outward, shaped for grasping and guiding, while additional limbs beneath the body allowed for steady movement along the substrate. Some species carried paddle-like limbs toward the rear, enabling them to push through the water when needed, shifting between walking and swimming without abrupt transition. This dual capability allowed them to navigate both the bottom and the water above it, occupying a range of positions within their surroundings. In certain forms, their size expanded to remarkable scales, with some individuals reaching lengths beyond 2 meters. This increase in size did not appear as an isolated feature, but as part of a broader pattern in which their bodies retained proportional balance even as they grew. Their exoskeletons provided support, distributing weight and maintaining structure in environments where buoyancy and resistance worked together. The result was a presence that moved with stability, capable of exerting control over both position and direction. Eurypterids were not confined to a single type of environment. While many inhabited shallow marine settings, others extended into freshwater systems, adapting to conditions that differed in salinity and composition. This flexibility suggests a capacity to tolerate variation, allowing them to spread across connected waterways and occupy regions where fewer competitors were present. In these spaces, they became a consistent part of the ecological fabric, interacting with other organisms in ways that reflected their role as active participants rather than passive occupants. Their feeding behavior aligns with a predatory lifestyle, though not defined by sudden bursts of speed. Instead, their structure suggests a methodical approach, using their appendages to capture and manipulate prey. Smaller organisms would have been guided toward their mouthparts, where processing occurred through coordinated movement rather than force alone. This mode of feeding indicates a reliance on precision, an ability to engage with their environment in a controlled and sustained manner. As arthropods, Eurypterids represent an extension of a body plan already established, yet taken to a scale and function that distinguishes them within their group. Their presence demonstrates how familiar structural frameworks can be adapted to new roles, expanding beyond their earlier expressions. The segmentation, jointed limbs, and protective exoskeleton remain consistent, but their application evolves, allowing for increased size and a broader range of interaction. Through their long presence in both marine and freshwater environments, Eurypterids contributed to the shaping of early ecosystems, influencing the distribution and behavior of other organisms. Their interactions formed part of a network that continued to grow in complexity, each movement adding to the ongoing exchange that defined these ancient waters. Over time, their forms would no longer appear within the record, their lineage coming to an end despite the scale and adaptability they once displayed. What remains are the impressions of their bodies, preserved in layers that hint at their movement and structure, offering a quiet indication of a time when arthropods reached sizes and roles that would not persist in the same way again. Weight gathers in the water in a different way here, not as mass alone, but as a presence shaped by density and control, moving through its surroundings with a steadiness that reflects a new stage in the evolution of vertebrate life. Dunkleosteus occupies this space, emerging during the Devonian period as one of the earliest large predators built upon an internal framework, its form distinct from the segmented exteriors that had dominated earlier eras. Its head and upper body are encased in thick plates of bone, fitted together in a structure that forms a rigid shield across its front. These plates do not overlap loosely, but connect with precision, creating a continuous surface that protects vital regions while allowing movement at carefully defined points. The armor carries weight, yet its distribution suggests balance, enabling the animal to maintain control as it advances through the water. Behind this reinforced front, the body extends into a more flexible form, tapering into a tail that provides propulsion, linking stability with motion. Where its mouth would be expected to hold rows of teeth, there are instead sharpened edges formed from the bone itself. These blade-like structures curve inward, creating a mechanism capable of closing with considerable force. The movement of the jaws is guided by powerful muscles anchored within the armored head, allowing the mouth to open and shut in a controlled, forceful action. When brought together, these edges do not simply grasp, but shear, capable of breaking through the protective coverings of other organisms. Evidence preserved within fossil remains indicates that this bite was not theoretical, but actively used in feeding. Markings on ancient shells and skeletal elements show patterns consistent with crushing and slicing, suggesting encounters where Dunkleosteus engaged with prey that required both strength and precision to overcome. This feeding style reflects a shift in predatory capability, where the ability to process larger and more resistant organisms becomes part of the ecological balance. As a vertebrate, its internal structure supports a different mode of movement and coordination. Muscles attach to a framework that allows for sustained propulsion, enabling it to move through its environment with direction and intent. This internal support system distinguishes it from earlier dominant forms, marking a transition toward body plans that would later diversify into many directions. The combination of armor and mobility suggests a balance between protection and function, allowing it to engage actively without sacrificing structural integrity. Within the Devonian seas, Dunkleosteus occupies a position near the upper levels of the food web. Its size, armor, and feeding mechanism place it among the most capable predators of its time, influencing the distribution and behavior of other organisms within its environment. Its presence contributes to a system where interactions become more layered, with larger vertebrates beginning to shape ecological dynamics alongside the invertebrate forms that preceded them. Though its form appears formidable, it remains bound to the conditions that supported its existence. Over time, changes in environment and competition would alter those conditions, and Dunkleosteus would no longer appear within the record. Its disappearance reflects the same pattern seen across earlier forms, where success within one period does not extend indefinitely. What remains are the preserved plates and outlines of its structure, offering a clear indication of a moment when vertebrate life expanded into new roles, carrying forward the ongoing transformation of ecosystems, where form, function, and interaction continue to evolve together within the shifting context of the ancient world. A quiet shift unfolds beneath the surface, not marked by a single form rising above the rest, but by a gradual widening of variation, as if the water itself begins to carry more possibilities within it. Bodies that once followed simpler patterns start to diversify, branching into new shapes and functions that alter the rhythm of movement and interaction across entire regions. This interval, often called the Age of Fish, does not begin with sudden dominance, but with an accumulation of changes that reshape how vertebrate life expresses itself. Early fish had existed before this period, their forms lacking the structures that would later define their successors. Many moved with open mouths that filtered or absorbed food without the ability to grasp or process it in a controlled way. Their bodies were streamlined, yet limited in how they could engage with other organisms. Over time, subtle modifications begin to appear in certain lineages, leading to the development of jaws, a feature that transforms both feeding and interaction. The emergence of jaws introduces a new form of precision. Rather than relying on passive intake, these organisms can now seize, hold, and manipulate their food. This change alters not only individual behavior, but the relationships between species. Predation becomes more varied, with new strategies unfolding as different forms of jaws evolve. Some are suited for crushing, others for slicing, each reflecting a particular adaptation to available resources. As these changes take hold, diversity expands. Fish begin to occupy a broader range of ecological roles, their bodies adapting to different depths, conditions, and methods of feeding. Some develop heavier coverings, with bony plates that provide protection, while others retain lighter forms that allow for greater speed and maneuverability. Fins become more specialized, aiding in balance, steering, and propulsion, giving these animals greater control over their movement through the water. This period marks a transition from jawless to jawed vertebrates, a shift that carries implications far beyond the immediate environment. The internal structures that support jaws also contribute to changes in the skull and overall body plan, setting the stage for further developments. Muscles, bones, and connective systems begin to coordinate in more complex ways, allowing for a wider range of motion and interaction. These adjustments do not occur all at once, but through a series of incremental changes that accumulate over generations. Within this expanding diversity, certain patterns begin to establish themselves, forming the basis for later evolutionary paths. The distinction between different groups of fish becomes more defined, with variations in structure leading to separate lineages that will continue to evolve in their own directions. Some of these lines will give rise to forms capable of existing beyond the water, carrying forward the adaptations developed during this time into entirely new environments. The significance of this period lies not only in the variety of fish that emerge, but in the foundation it provides for all later vertebrate life. The introduction of jaws, the refinement of internal support systems, and the diversification of body plans create a framework that will persist even as individual species come and go. Beneath the surface, within the steady movement of these early fish, the groundwork is laid for a continuity that extends far beyond their own existence, shaping the possibilities that will follow in ways that remain embedded in the structure of life itself. Across stretches of land that had only recently begun to hold life, vertical forms begin to rise, altering the surface in ways that extend beyond the ground itself. What had once been low, scattered growth now gathers into taller structures, lifting living tissue upward into the air, creating layers that did not previously exist. These early forests are not dense in the way later ones would become, yet they introduce a new dimension, a quiet architecture that reshapes both light and space. The plants that compose these environments are among the first to develop tree-like forms with supportive tissues that allow them to stand upright and extend above their surroundings. Their surfaces interact with the atmosphere, drawing in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, a gradual process that accumulates over long spans of time. As these forests spread, the composition of the air shifts, not abruptly, but through a steady increase in available oxygen, altering the conditions under which other forms of life can function. Beneath and between these growing structures, the ground begins to change. Roots extend into the substrate, breaking apart surfaces and stabilizing the soil, while fallen material collects and decomposes, forming layers of organic matter. This accumulation creates a more complex environment, one that holds moisture and nutrients, allowing for a wider range of organisms to establish themselves. The land, once largely exposed and variable, begins to support more consistent conditions, providing a foundation for further diversification. Within these developing habitats, arthropods expand their presence, their forms adapting to the opportunities created by this new environment. Some move across the forest floor, navigating through layers of decaying plant material, while others climb the vertical structures, exploring spaces above the ground. Their segmented bodies and jointed limbs allow them to interact with surfaces in varied ways, making use of both horizontal and vertical planes. As they diversify, their roles within the ecosystem become more defined, contributing to the breakdown of organic material and the movement of nutrients. Insects begin to emerge within this expanding framework, their small bodies suited to the intricate spaces created by plant structures. Their presence introduces new interactions, including feeding patterns that involve both living and decaying material. Some feed on plant tissues, while others consume smaller organisms or organic debris, each contributing to the flow of energy through the system. Their diversity reflects the increasing complexity of the environment as new niches become available and are gradually filled. The interaction between plants and arthropods forms a network that extends beyond simple coexistence. As insects feed on plants, they influence growth patterns and distribution, while plants provide both sustenance and structure. This relationship, though still developing, begins to shape the dynamics of terrestrial ecosystems, linking the presence of vegetation with the diversity of animal life. As oxygen levels continue to rise, the capacity for larger and more active organisms increases, though this change unfolds slowly, without immediate transformation. The atmosphere, enriched over time, supports more efficient energy use, allowing organisms to sustain activity in ways that were previously limited. This shift remains subtle within the context of this period, yet it establishes conditions that will influence future developments. Within these early forests, life becomes layered, not only in physical space, but in function and interaction. The vertical growth of plants, the movement of arthropods, and the gradual enrichment of the environment create a setting where complexity can deepen. What begins as scattered growth evolves into interconnected systems, where each element contributes to a broader pattern, quietly shaping the trajectory of life on land. Air begins to carry more than movement alone, holding within it a density that allows bodies to expand in ways that would not remain possible in later ages. Within this enriched atmosphere, insects rise into forms that stretch the limits of their structure, their size supported not by internal lungs, but by a system that draws oxygen directly through openings along their bodies. As the concentration of oxygen increases, this method of respiration becomes more efficient, allowing energy to move through tissues at a scale that permits larger growth. Among these early aerial forms are dragonfly-like insects, whose wings extend outward to spans exceeding 2 feet, their presence defined not only by size, but by the steady rhythm of their flight. Their wings, thin and veined, catch the air with precision, creating lift through rapid, controlled motion. Each movement is guided by a coordination that reflects both strength and balance, allowing them to glide and adjust with subtle shifts rather than abrupt changes. Their bodies remain elongated and light relative to their span, maintaining a structure that supports sustained movement above the surface. These insects do not occupy the air in isolation. Their size and mobility place them among the earliest terrestrial predators capable of pursuing prey beyond the ground. Smaller organisms, moving among the vegetation or across the surface, become part of a system in which flight introduces a new dimension of interaction. The ability to approach from above alters patterns of movement below, influencing how other forms navigate their environment, even in the absence of direct contact. The conditions that allow such size are closely tied to the atmosphere itself. Oxygen, diffusing through the tracheal system of these insects, must reach all parts of the body without the aid of circulatory transport in the way seen in later vertebrates. At higher concentrations, this process can sustain larger volumes of tissue, supporting growth that would otherwise be limited. As oxygen levels remain elevated, the boundary of possible size extends, allowing these insects to develop in ways that reflect the specific conditions of their time. Their presence contributes to a broader transformation of terrestrial ecosystems. The air, once largely unoccupied by active predators, becomes a space of movement and interaction, linking ground and sky through continuous activity. The flight of these insects introduces a new layer to the flow of energy, connecting plant life, smaller organisms, and larger aerial forms in a system that extends beyond the surface. As they move through these environments, their wings produce subtle currents, their passage marking the air with patterns that dissipate as quickly as they form. Their interactions, though often brief, accumulate across the landscape, influencing the distribution and behavior of other organisms. In this way, they become part of a network that continues to grow in complexity, each movement contributing to the shaping of the system as a whole. Over time, as atmospheric conditions shift and oxygen levels decline from their earlier peaks, the capacity to sustain such large forms diminishes. The structures that once supported expansive wingspans and extended bodies no longer function in the same way, leading to a gradual reduction in size among their descendants. The forms that remain are scaled differently, adapted to a new balance between oxygen availability and structural demand. What endures in the record are the impressions of wings and bodies preserved in stone, delicate outlines that hint at a period when the air itself allowed life to extend beyond its later limits, carrying within it the possibility of scale that would not return in quite the same form again. Along the edges of quiet waterways, where submerged ground meets open air in a shifting boundary, bodies begin to take on a different balance, carrying both the memory of water and the possibility of land within their form. The first amphibians emerge in this space, not as creatures fully adapted to either realm, but as intermediaries, shaped by the demands of two environments that overlap but never fully merge. Their bodies retain features suited for life in water, including elongated shapes and tails that assist in swimming, yet new structures begin to define their movement across solid surfaces. Fins, once used solely for propulsion through water, gradually transform into limbs capable of bearing weight. These limbs do not move with the efficiency of later terrestrial animals, but they provide enough support to allow short excursions onto land, enabling these organisms to navigate shallow margins and temporary pools. The internal structure of these limbs reflects a shift in function. Bones become more robust, arranged in patterns that distribute weight and allow for controlled movement. Joints begin to articulate in ways that permit bending and extension, offering a range of motion that supports both swimming and limited walking. This dual capability defines their existence as they remain closely tied to water even as they explore new spaces beyond it. Breathing also adapts during this transition. While gills remain present in early stages, lungs begin to develop, allowing these animals to draw oxygen directly from the air. This ability provides a significant advantage in environments where water oxygen levels fluctuate, yet it does not replace the need for aquatic conditions entirely. The skin, often permeable and sensitive to moisture, plays a role in respiration as well, requiring a damp environment to function effectively. Reproduction remains firmly anchored to water. Eggs are laid in aquatic settings where they can develop without the risk of drying out. The early life stages, including larval forms, depend on water for survival, undergoing transformations before taking on the characteristics of the adult. This cycle ensures that, despite their growing presence on land, amphibians cannot fully detach from the environments that first shaped them. Their movement onto land introduces new interactions, both with the environment and with other organisms. On the ground, they encounter conditions that differ in texture, temperature, and stability, requiring constant adjustment. Their senses, tuned initially for aquatic life, begin to respond to stimuli in air, though not with the same refinement seen in later terrestrial animals. Each step forward is measured, shaped by both opportunity and limitation. Within this transitional phase, amphibians occupy a unique position. They bridge two domains, carrying traits that reflect both past and future, yet fully belonging to neither. Their presence expands the range of life on land, contributing to the gradual establishment of more complex terrestrial ecosystems. They feed, move, and interact within these spaces, leaving traces that indicate a growing integration between water and land-based life. Over time, further adaptations will extend this transition, leading to organisms capable of existing entirely on land. Yet, within these early amphibians, the process remains incomplete, defined by dependence as much as by progress. Their forms illustrate a stage in evolution where change is ongoing, where the shift from one environment to another unfolds through gradual modification rather than sudden transformation, each generation carrying forward the adjustments that allow life to continue expanding its reach. Land gathers into a single, immense mass, its boundaries stretching across the planet in a configuration that reshapes climate, movement, and the distribution of life. This unified continent, later known as Pangaea, alters the flow of winds and the paths of water, creating interior regions that lie far from coastal influence. Within these expansive interiors, conditions become more varied, with shifts in temperature and moisture that form a wide range of environments, each supporting its own patterns of life. Across this connected landscape, ecosystems reach a level of diversity that reflects the long accumulation of earlier changes. Forests extend across certain regions, while other areas remain open, shaped by dryness and exposure. Rivers cut through the terrain, forming corridors that link different habitats, allowing organisms to move and interact across distances that were once separated by oceans. On the edges of this vast landmass, coastal zones continue to support life influenced by both terrestrial and marine conditions, maintaining connections between water and land. Within these environments, reptile-like creatures begin to take on more prominent roles. Their bodies, adapted to life on land, show a reduced dependence on water compared to earlier forms. Skin becomes less permeable, allowing them to retain moisture more effectively, while reproductive strategies shift toward eggs that can develop outside of aquatic settings. This change enables them to occupy areas further from water sources, expanding their presence across the landscape. Their movement is supported by limbs that carry their weight with greater efficiency, allowing for sustained activity on land. Some forms develop elongated bodies with low stances, while others stand higher, adjusting their posture to suit different modes of life. Their diets vary as well, with some feeding on plant material and others occupying predatory roles, each contributing to the structure of the ecosystems they inhabit. As these organisms spread, food chains become more intricate, reflecting the interconnected nature of the environments in which they exist. Energy flows through multiple levels, from plants that capture and store it, to herbivores that consume them, and onward to predators that rely on these primary consumers. Each level interacts with those above and below, forming networks that maintain a dynamic balance. The relationships are not fixed, but adjust continuously, responding to changes in population, climate, and resource availability. Marine ecosystems continue to develop alongside those on land, maintaining their own complexity while remaining linked to the broader system. Life in the oceans reflects similar patterns of interaction, with organisms occupying various roles within layered food webs. These parallel developments on land and in water contribute to a planet where life is distributed across multiple domains, each influencing the other in subtle ways. The arrangement of Pangaea itself plays a role in shaping these interactions. With much of the land connected, organisms can disperse more widely, encountering new conditions and forming new relationships. At the same time, the vast interior regions present challenges, with limited access to moisture and more extreme temperature variations. These factors influence which forms can persist, guiding the distribution of species across the continent. In this period, life reaches a level of organization and diversity that reflects the culmination of long processes, each layer built upon those that came before. The systems that emerge are complex, interconnected, and responsive, carrying within them the accumulated adaptations of earlier eras. Within this expansive world, the patterns of interaction, movement, and survival are woven together into a structure that represents one of the most developed stages of life before the changes that will follow reshape it once again. Shapes begin to appear across the land that seem familiar at a glance, yet reveal a different lineage when followed more closely, their forms carrying features that echo later animals while belonging to a much earlier branch. Among these are the early Synapsids, a group that includes creatures like Dimetrodon, whose presence across Permian landscapes introduces a set of structures that stand apart from both earlier amphibians and later reptiles. Dimetrodon moves with a low, extended body supported by sturdy limbs that spread outward, its weight distributed close to the ground. The head is proportionally large, with jaws lined by differentiated teeth that vary in shape, suggesting a more specialized approach to feeding. This variation allows for slicing and gripping, indicating a diet that involves active predation rather than simple consumption. Its posture and movement reflect a balance between strength and stability, enabling it to navigate the terrain with a controlled, deliberate motion. Rising from its back is the feature that most clearly distinguishes it, a tall sail formed by elongated neural spines extending upward from the vertebrae. This structure, covered by skin, creates a broad surface that catches light and air, though its exact function remains uncertain. It may have played a role in regulating body temperature, allowing heat to be absorbed or released more efficiently, or it may have served as a display structure, signaling presence or status within its environment. Whatever its purpose, it represents a form of adaptation that does not persist in later lineages, marking a unique expression of biological design. Other synapsids share similar characteristics, though their forms vary, reflecting a diversity that extends beyond a single species. Some exhibit more compact bodies, while others carry different arrangements of teeth and skull shapes, each variation indicating a distinct ecological role. These organisms are not dinosaurs, though their appearance often leads to confusion when viewed without context. Their lineage diverges earlier, representing a separate branch of evolution that will eventually give rise to mammals, carrying forward traits that will be refined over vast spans of time. Their presence within Permian ecosystems contributes to the complexity already established, adding new layers to the interactions that define these environments. As predators and herbivores, they occupy positions within the food chains that influence the distribution and behavior of other organisms. Their feeding patterns, movement, and reproduction all integrate into the broader network, shaping the balance that exists across land and water. The distinction between these early synapsids and later reptiles lies not only in visible structure, but in underlying anatomical differences that guide their development. Openings in the skull, arrangements of muscles, and patterns of growth all point to a lineage that follows its own path, separate yet parallel to others that will emerge in later periods. These differences, though subtle in fossil form, represent fundamental divergences that will influence the direction of evolution far beyond the time in which these creatures lived. Within this context, the strange appearance of sail-backed animals and their relatives reflects not an anomaly, but a stage in the unfolding of life where multiple pathways coexist, each exploring different solutions to the challenges of survival. Their forms, preserved in rock, provide a record of these explorations, showing that the familiar shapes of later animals were preceded by a wider range of possibilities, many of which would not continue, yet all contributing to the broader story of life's progression. Patterns that once appeared broad and flexible begin to narrow into more defined roles, as if life is no longer exploring every possibility at once, but settling into specific positions within an increasingly structured system. Organisms that had once shared overlapping ways of living start to diverge, each one adapting to a particular set of conditions that shapes how it feeds, moves, and survives. This process of specialization does not unfold abruptly, but accumulates over time, refining the connections that bind each part of the environment to the rest. Within these developing systems, niches begin to take form, not as fixed spaces, but as sets of relationships that define how an organism fits into its surroundings. Some creatures become closely tied to certain food sources, evolving structures that allow them to access or process those resources more efficiently than others. Others adapt to specific conditions of temperature, moisture, or terrain, finding stability within environments that might seem restrictive but offer reduced competition. These specialized roles create a distribution of life that is more ordered, with each organism contributing to a broader arrangement. As specialization deepens, the interaction between predators and prey becomes more intricate. Predators refine their methods, developing features that enhance detection, capture, and consumption, while prey respond with adaptations that reduce the likelihood of being found or overcome. Speed, camouflage, armor, and behavioral shifts all emerge as part of this exchange, each adjustment prompting a corresponding response. This ongoing interaction creates a dynamic balance where neither side remains unchanged for long and where the outcome of each encounter influences future developments. The effects of these adaptations extend beyond individual species, shaping entire communities. When a predator becomes more effective, it alters the population of its prey, which in turn affects the organisms that depend on that prey, creating a cascade of changes that move through the ecosystem. Similarly, when prey develop new defenses, they influence the success of predators, prompting further adaptation. These interconnected responses form a network of influence where each change resonates across multiple levels. Ecosystems, as a result, become more tightly linked, with fewer elements existing in isolation. Energy flows through these systems along defined pathways, moving from one level to another in a sequence that reflects both availability and interaction. The removal or alteration of one component can lead to adjustments throughout the network, demonstrating the degree to which each part depends on the others. Stability, in this context, is maintained not by simplicity, but by the ability of the system to absorb and respond to change. Within this increasing complexity, life begins to show patterns that will persist into later periods. Specialized feeding structures, refined modes of movement, and intricate sensory systems all contribute to a more detailed expression of biological form. These developments do not eliminate variation, but channel it into directions that are shaped by the constraints and opportunities of the environment. The landscape, both on land and in water, reflects this shift, with organisms occupying positions that are more clearly defined than before. Each niche represents a balance between what is available and what can be sustained, and each organism, through its adaptations, becomes part of a larger structure that continues to evolve. In this gradual refinement, life moves toward a state where complexity is not just present, but organized, forming systems that are increasingly interconnected and responsive to the subtle changes that pass through them. Subtle irregularities begin to thread through the system, not as immediate disruption, but as small deviations that accumulate across land and sea, gradually altering the conditions that had once supported a wide balance of life. The stability that defined earlier intervals does not vanish at once, yet it begins to loosen, shaped by forces that move beneath the surface and across the atmosphere in ways that are not always visible within a single moment. Across the late Permian, climates begin to shift with increasing variability. Regions that once maintained consistent patterns of temperature and moisture start to experience fluctuations that stretch beyond their usual range. Some areas grow drier, their soils losing the steady input of water that had sustained plant life, while others encounter changes that alter seasonal rhythms. These variations do not occur uniformly, but spread unevenly across the vast landmass, creating conditions where some ecosystems struggle to adjust, while others persist for a time within narrowing margins. Within the oceans, changes unfold in parallel, though their effects are carried through currents rather than air. The chemistry of the water begins to shift, influenced by alterations in temperature and the balance of dissolved gases. Oxygen levels in certain regions decline, reducing the capacity of the water to support organisms that depend on its presence. This reduction does not affect all areas equally, but creates zones where life becomes more difficult to sustain, forcing organisms to adapt, migrate, or diminish. At the same time, volcanic activity intensifies, releasing material from deep within the earth into the atmosphere and across the surface. These eruptions do not occur as isolated events, but as extended periods of activity that reshape the surrounding environment. Gases released into the air contribute to changes in temperature, while particulate matter can influence the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. The land itself is altered by the flow of molten rock, covering existing habitats and introducing new terrain that must be colonized or avoided. These processes, though distinct, begin to interact, creating a network of influence that extends across multiple systems. Increased volcanic emissions contribute to atmospheric changes, which in turn affect climate patterns, while shifts in temperature influence ocean chemistry, linking the conditions of land and sea. The result is not a single cause, but a convergence of factors that gradually destabilize the balance that had been established over long periods. Organisms respond to these changes in varied ways. Some adjust their ranges, moving toward regions where conditions remain within tolerable limits, while others alter their behavior or physiology in response to new pressures. Yet, as the fluctuations continue, the space for adaptation becomes more constrained. The interconnected nature of ecosystems means that changes affecting one group can ripple outward, influencing others that rely on the same resources or conditions. The sense of continuity that once defined these systems begins to fragment, replaced by a more uncertain pattern where stability is temporary and often localized. Interactions that had been consistent become less predictable as shifts in climate and chemistry alter the availability of food and the structure of habitats. Each change contributes to a gradual weakening of the networks that had supported diverse and complex life. Within this emerging instability, the processes that shape the planet continue to operate, but their combined effects begin to push conditions toward thresholds that will lead to further transformation. The changes do not announce themselves as a single turning point, but gather slowly, their influence deepening over time, setting the stage for outcomes that will extend far beyond the moment in which they begin. The record narrows in a way that is difficult to mistake, as if the layers themselves begin to thin, holding fewer traces of the variety that once filled them. Around 252 million years ago, a transition unfolds that does not follow the gradual rhythms seen before, but instead marks a widespread reduction in life across both ocean and land. The shift is preserved not through dramatic singular events in the stone, but through absence, through the sudden decline of forms that had long been present. In marine environments, this change becomes especially pronounced. Organisms that once occupied a range of positions within the water column and along the seafloor begin to vanish from the record. Entire groups that had persisted through earlier fluctuations no longer appear in subsequent layers. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of marine species are lost during this interval, a reduction that alters not only individual populations, but the structure of entire ecosystems. Food webs that had developed over long periods are disrupted, their connections severed as key species disappear. On land, the pattern follows a similar course, though expressed across different forms. Approximately 70% of terrestrial species are lost, including many of the organisms that had shaped the landscapes of the Permian world. Plant communities shift, with some forms declining while others struggle to maintain their presence. Animal populations diminish, leaving behind fewer traces of movement and interaction. The environments that remain show signs of reduced diversity, with fewer species occupying broader roles. This event surpasses later extinctions in scale, including the one that would eventually end the age of dinosaurs. Its reach extends across multiple domains, affecting organisms regardless of their size or position within the ecosystem. The causes are not confined to a single factor, but arise from a convergence of changes that had been building over time, now reaching a point where their combined effects exceed the capacity of many species to adapt. As these losses unfold, the balance that once connected different levels of life begins to unravel. Predators lose their prey, herbivores lose their food sources, and organisms that depended on stable environmental conditions find those conditions altered beyond their tolerance. The interconnected nature of ecosystems means that the disappearance of one group contributes to the decline of others, creating a cascading effect that moves through the system. The duration of this extinction is not confined to a single moment, but extends over a span of time in which conditions remain unfavorable for recovery. The reduction in diversity leads to simpler ecosystems, where fewer interactions take place and where the flow of energy becomes less varied. The complexity that had defined earlier periods is replaced by a more limited structure, one that reflects the loss of many specialized forms. Within the layers that follow, the absence becomes part of the record itself. The spaces, once occupied by a wide range of organisms, remain empty or are filled only by a smaller number of surviving forms. This shift does not erase the past, but it marks a boundary between what had existed and what would come next. In this interval, life does not cease entirely, but it contracts, its presence reduced to those forms capable of enduring the conditions that prevail. The Great Dying, as it is often called, stands as the most extensive extinction known, its scale defining a turning point in the history of life where the continuity of earlier systems gives way to a landscape shaped by loss and the slow beginning of renewal. Far to the north of the ancient supercontinent, a region begins to open in a way that reshapes both land and atmosphere, not through a single eruption, but through a prolonged outpouring of molten rock that spreads across vast distances. In what is now known as Siberia, immense volcanic activity unfolds over extended intervals, layering the surface with basalt and releasing gases that rise steadily into the air. These eruptions do not subside quickly, but continue in pulses, each one adding to the accumulation of change already underway. From these volcanic sources, large quantities of carbon dioxide enter the atmosphere, altering its composition and influencing how heat is retained. As these greenhouse gases increase, the balance between incoming and outgoing energy shifts, leading to a gradual rise in global temperatures. This warming does not occur evenly across all regions, yet its effects are widespread, influencing both terrestrial climates and oceanic conditions. Land becomes subject to greater extremes, with patterns of moisture and temperature moving beyond the ranges that many organisms had adapted to over long periods. The oceans respond to this warming in ways that extend beneath the surface. As temperatures rise, the capacity of water to hold dissolved oxygen decreases, leading to conditions where oxygen becomes limited in deeper and even mid-level layers. These zones of reduced oxygen, often referred to as anoxic regions, expand over time, creating environments where many marine organisms can no longer survive. The reduction in oxygen disrupts metabolic processes, affecting species across multiple levels of the ecosystem. At the same time, chemical reactions within the ocean begin to shift, influenced by both temperature and the influx of substances from volcanic emissions. The balance of nutrients and dissolved elements changes, affecting the growth of organisms that rely on stable conditions. In some regions, microbial activity increases, further altering the composition of the water and contributing to the depletion of oxygen. These processes interact, reinforcing one another and extending the reach of unfavorable conditions. Beneath the ocean floor, additional changes may be taking place. Methane, stored in frozen deposits known as clathrates, can become unstable as temperatures rise. If released into the water and eventually the atmosphere, this methane acts as a potent greenhouse gas, amplifying the warming already in progress. While the exact extent of this release remains uncertain, its potential contribution adds another layer to the system of feedbacks driving environmental change. The combination of volcanic emissions, atmospheric alteration, and oceanic shifts creates a set of conditions that extend across the planet, linking processes that operate on land, in the air, and beneath the sea. Each factor alone might be absorbed over time, but together they form a network of influence that exceeds the capacity of many systems to maintain stability. The warming atmosphere intensifies ocean changes, while ocean conditions feed back into atmospheric dynamics, creating a cycle that deepens the overall effect. Organisms, already shaped by earlier fluctuations, encounter these changes as a continuous pressure rather than a single event. Adaptation becomes more difficult as multiple variables shift simultaneously, reducing the availability of stable environments. The interconnected nature of ecosystems means that the impact on one group extends to others, creating a chain of responses that move through both marine and terrestrial systems. Within this convergence of forces, the conditions that once supported diverse and complex life become increasingly difficult to sustain. The causes of the Permian extinction do not lie in one isolated process, but in the alignment of several, each reinforcing the others, guiding the planet toward a state where survival becomes limited to those forms capable of enduring a rapidly changing world. Connections begin to loosen in ways that are not immediately visible in a single place, but become clear when the broader pattern is followed, as relationships that once held steady start to falter across multiple levels at once. What had been a network of exchanges, carrying energy from one organism to another, begins to fragment, each break altering the flow that once sustained the whole. The structure of ecosystems, built over long periods of gradual refinement, no longer maintains its continuity. At the foundation of these systems, organisms that supported the earliest stages of food chains begin to decline. Their reduction limits the energy available to those that depend on them, creating an imbalance that spreads outward. Herbivores encounter diminishing resources, their populations decreasing as the plants or smaller organisms they consume become less abundant. This initial disruption extends upward, affecting predators that rely on these herbivores, reducing their ability to find sustenance. As key species disappear, the roles they once fulfilled remain unoccupied. Some organisms had acted as stabilizing elements, regulating populations or contributing to nutrient cycles that maintained environmental balance. Their absence creates gaps that are not easily filled, leading to further instability. Without these influences, populations that remain may fluctuate unpredictably or decline further as conditions become less favorable. The interconnected nature of these systems means that each loss contributes to additional losses. A predator that disappears affects not only its immediate prey, but also the organisms that shared its environment, altering competitive relationships and resource distribution. Similarly, the loss of a plant species can influence soil composition, moisture retention, and the availability of shelter, affecting multiple layers of life simultaneously. These cascading effects move through ecosystems in a series of responses, each one amplifying the impact of the previous change. Marine environments reflect a similar pattern, with disruptions in lower levels of the food web affecting organisms higher up. As oxygen levels decline and conditions shift, species that once occupied stable niches begin to vanish, leaving fewer interactions to sustain the structure of the system. The reduction in diversity simplifies these ecosystems, reducing the number of pathways through which energy can move, making them more vulnerable to further change. On land, the breakdown of food chains alters the distribution of life across regions. Areas that once supported a variety of organisms become less populated, with fewer species able to persist under the changing conditions. The interactions that once defined these environments, including predation, competition, and cooperation, become less frequent, leading to a quieter, more limited pattern of life. The collapse of ecosystems does not occur as a single moment, but as a process that unfolds over time, with each stage contributing to the next. Recovery, when it begins, is slow and uneven. The conditions that follow the initial collapse do not immediately support the reestablishment of complex systems, requiring long periods before new interactions can develop. Surviving organisms must adapt to environments that differ from those that preceded them, shaping new relationships that gradually rebuild the structure of ecosystems. Within this extended interval, the absence of former complexity becomes part of the landscape, a reflection of how interconnected systems can unravel when key elements are removed. The collapse leaves behind a framework that must be reconstructed, not by restoring what was lost, but by forming new patterns that arise from the limited set of forms that remain, carrying forward the process of life in a quieter, more constrained state. Silence in the record takes on a different meaning here, not as a brief absence between appearances, but as a lasting gap where entire forms no longer reemerge, their patterns of structure and behavior ending without continuation. The disappearance of so many organisms during this interval is not followed by their gradual return in altered forms, but by a complete severing of lineages that had once persisted through earlier changes. Some of these organisms belong to branches of life that had developed over long periods, refining their structures and interactions within specific environments. When conditions shifted beyond the limits they could endure, these branches did not leave behind smaller populations capable of recovery. Without surviving groups to carry forward their genetic variations, there was no pathway for these forms to re-establish themselves. Their absence becomes permanent, not because they were replaced directly, but because the continuity required for their return was lost. The scale of the extinction contributes to this outcome. When losses occur across multiple regions simultaneously, the likelihood of isolated populations surviving decreases. In earlier periods, environmental changes might affect certain areas while leaving others relatively stable, allowing species to persist in refuges and later expand again. During this event, however, the reach of changing conditions extends across much of the planet, reducing the number of places where life can continue without interruption. Environmental conditions themselves play a central role in preventing recovery. Elevated temperatures, altered atmospheric composition, and changes in ocean chemistry create a set of circumstances that remain unfavorable for extended periods. Organisms adapted to previous conditions find themselves unable to function effectively, with their physiological processes disrupted by the new environment. Even if small populations manage to survive initially, the persistence of these conditions limits their ability to grow and reestablish stable communities. In the oceans, reduced oxygen levels and shifting chemical balances create zones where many forms cannot survive at all. Species that depended on well-oxygenated water or stable nutrient cycles encounter environments that no longer support their basic requirements. On land, fluctuations in climate and moisture levels alter habitats in ways that remove the resources necessary for survival. Plants that once formed the base of ecosystems may decline, leaving herbivores without food and further reducing the chances for recovery among higher levels of the food chain. The interconnected nature of ecosystems amplifies these effects. When foundational species are lost, the organisms that depended on them also decline, creating a chain of disappearance that extends through multiple levels. This process reduces the diversity needed to support complex interactions, making it more difficult for ecosystems to rebuild even when conditions begin to stabilize. In some cases, new forms eventually emerge to occupy similar roles, but they do so through separate evolutionary pathways, not as direct continuations of what was lost. The shapes and behaviors may resemble earlier forms in function, yet they arise independently, reflecting the adaptability of life rather than the persistence of specific lineages. The absence of these lost branches becomes part of the ongoing structure of life, shaping what follows by limiting the range of forms that continue forward. What remains is not a simple reduction, but a redefinition of possibility, where the paths that once existed are closed, and the future unfolds from a narrower set of starting points, each one carrying only a portion of what had come before. In the quiet intervals that follow widespread loss, what remains is not defined by size or dominance, but by persistence. A set of forms that continue, not because they were the most specialized, but because they could endure conditions that shifted beyond expectation. Among the survivors are organisms that carry a different set of traits, ones that favor flexibility over refinement, allowing them to adjust as their surroundings change in ways that others could not withstand. These surviving species are often smaller in scale, their bodies requiring fewer resources to sustain themselves. This reduced demand allows them to persist in environments where food and stability have become limited. Their size does not reflect weakness, but efficiency, a balance between energy intake and expenditure that becomes crucial when resources fluctuate or decline. In landscapes where larger, more specialized forms have disappeared, these smaller organisms find space to continue, occupying niches that remain viable under altered conditions. Adaptability defines their continued presence. Rather than relying on a narrow range of food sources or environmental conditions, they are capable of using a variety of resources, shifting their behavior as availability changes. This generalist approach allows them to navigate uncertainty, feeding on what is present rather than what is preferred. In doing so, they avoid the constraints that had limited more specialized species whose survival depended on stable and specific conditions. Their physiology often reflects this flexibility. Systems that can tolerate variations in temperature, moisture, and chemical composition provide an advantage when the environment no longer maintains consistent patterns. Some may enter states of reduced activity when conditions become unfavorable, conserving energy until more suitable circumstances return. Others may reproduce more rapidly, increasing the likelihood that at least some individuals will persist through periods of instability. The environments in which they survive are often simplified compared to those that existed before. With fewer species present, interactions become less complex, yet the remaining organisms continue to form connections that sustain the flow of energy. These systems, though limited, provide a foundation upon which future diversity can build. The survivors do not recreate what was lost, but they maintain continuity, carrying forward the processes that allow life to persist. Within these reduced ecosystems, the absence of former competitors and predators alters the balance. Generalist species may expand their roles, occupying positions that were once held by multiple specialized forms. This expansion does not immediately lead to complexity, but it establishes a presence that can adapt as conditions gradually stabilize. Over time, as environments begin to recover, these organisms may give rise to new variations, each one shaped by the conditions that allowed their predecessors to endure. The traits that define these survivors, flexibility, tolerance, and efficiency, become the basis for future development. While they do not represent the diversity of the past, they carry within them the capacity to generate new forms as the environment changes. Their persistence ensures that life continues, even in a reduced state, bridging the gap between the complexity that was lost and the possibilities that will emerge. In this way, survival is not determined by dominance, but by the ability to remain when conditions shift beyond familiarity, allowing life to endure through adaptability, holding its place within a world that has been reshaped and preparing quietly for the gradual return of diversity. Across the layers that follow the Great Reduction, the presence of life feels more dispersed, not in motion, but in its absence, as spaces that once held intricate interactions now remain unoccupied. The structure of the world continues, shaped by land, water, and atmosphere, yet the density of living forms within it has diminished, leaving a landscape where activity is more limited and less varied. In these conditions, ecological niches that had once been filled by specific organisms remain open. Roles that had been defined by long periods of adaptation no longer have clear occupants, creating gaps within the system. These empty positions do not immediately attract new forms, as the processes required to fill them unfold gradually. The absence of established competitors allows surviving species to move into these spaces, though often without the specialization that had previously characterized them. Reduced competition becomes a defining feature of this interval. With fewer species present, the pressure to compete for resources lessens, allowing those that remain to expand their range of activity. Generalist organisms, already capable of using varied resources, begin to occupy broader roles within their environments. They feed on a wider array of materials, move across different habitats, and establish themselves in areas that had once been occupied by more specialized forms. This expansion does not restore complexity, but instead creates a simplified version of earlier systems. The interactions that take place are fewer, and the pathways through which energy flows are less intricate. Where once multiple species might have shared similar roles with subtle differences, now a smaller number of organisms fulfill those roles more broadly. This shift results in ecosystems that are functional, yet lacking the layered diversity that had developed before the extinction. The physical environment continues to influence these patterns. Changes in climate and chemistry, still lingering from earlier events, shape the conditions under which life can persist. Some regions remain challenging, limiting the spread of organisms, while others provide more stable conditions where recovery can begin. The distribution of life reflects these variations, with certain areas showing signs of gradual increase in activity, while others remain sparsely populated. In the oceans, similar patterns emerge. Marine environments that once supported a wide range of species now contain fewer forms, with simpler food webs and reduced interaction. Organisms that survive in these waters occupy positions that allow them to function within the altered conditions, though the overall structure remains less complex. The flow of energy continues, but through narrower channels, reflecting the reduced diversity of participants. On land, the landscape carries traces of what once existed, though the organisms that shaped it are no longer present. Plant life begins to reestablish itself in certain areas, forming the base for future development, while animal life remains limited in both variety and distribution. The connections between these forms are still forming, their interactions gradually increasing as conditions allow. This quieter world does not represent an endpoint, but a phase in which life persists in a reduced state, maintaining continuity while the potential for future diversity slowly rebuilds. The absence of earlier complexity creates space for new developments, though these changes will require time to emerge. Within this interval, the planet holds a simpler pattern of life, one defined by endurance and gradual expansion, where the echoes of what was lost remain in the spaces that have yet to be filled. From the quieter landscapes left behind, movement begins to gather again, not as a sudden return of what once existed, but as a gradual emergence of forms that carry different structures and possibilities. The spaces that had remained unoccupied begin to hold new presence, as life continues its slow expansion into roles that had long remained empty. These developments do not mirror the past, but build upon what remains, shaping a world that reflects both loss and renewal. Among these emerging forms are early reptiles that extend beyond the patterns seen in earlier periods. Their bodies adapted to conditions that now favor independence from water. Their skin reduces moisture loss more effectively, allowing them to move across environments that fluctuate in temperature and dryness. Their eggs, protected by outer layers, can develop on land without the constant need for aquatic settings, freeing them from the limitations that had constrained earlier organisms. As these reptiles diversify, they begin to occupy a range of ecological roles, spreading across different habitats and adapting to varied conditions. Some develop elongated bodies suited for movement across open terrain, while others evolve forms that allow them to navigate more complex environments. Their feeding strategies vary as well, with some consuming plant material and others taking on predatory roles, each contributing to the rebuilding of food chains that had been disrupted. Within this expanding diversity, early ancestors of what will later be recognized as dinosaurs begin to appear. These forms are not yet dominant, but they represent a lineage that carries distinct structural features, including more upright limb positioning and changes in body balance that allow for more efficient movement. Their presence remains subtle within the broader landscape, yet it marks the beginning of a shift that will become more pronounced over time. The rebuilding of ecosystems unfolds gradually as interactions between organisms begin to increase in number and complexity. Plants continue to spread, providing the foundation for herbivorous species, while predators adapt to the availability of prey, re-establishing connections that define the flow of energy. These relationships do not immediately reach the complexity seen before the extinction, but they begin to form networks that grow more intricate as new species emerge. Environmental conditions, though still influenced by earlier disruptions, start to stabilize in certain regions, allowing for more consistent patterns of growth and interaction. As these conditions improve, the potential for diversification increases, enabling organisms to explore a wider range of adaptations. The process remains uneven, with some areas recovering more quickly than others, yet the overall trend reflects a slow expansion of life across both land and water. In this period, the direction of evolution shifts toward forms that can endure variability, favoring traits that allow for flexibility and resilience. These characteristics, carried forward from the survivors of earlier events, become integrated into the new lineages, shaping how they interact with their environment and with each other. The result is a set of organisms that are not simply replacements for those that were lost, but distinct expressions of life adapted to a changed world. As these new forms continue to develop, the structure of ecosystems begins to regain depth, with more layers of interaction forming over time. The process remains ongoing, defined by gradual change rather than sudden transformation, as life rebuilds itself through variation and adaptation, moving steadily toward a new balance that reflects both continuity and change within the evolving history of the planet. Absence shapes the direction of what follows, not as an empty pause, but as a condition that allows certain forms to expand without the constraints that once limited them. In the periods after the Great Reduction, the spaces left behind are not immediately filled by equivalents of what was lost. Instead, they remain open long enough for different lineages to enter, adjust, and establish themselves within environments that have been fundamentally altered. Among these emerging groups are early dinosaurs, whose ancestors had already begun to appear in modest forms, yet had not previously occupied dominant positions. Their rise is not the result of sudden transformation, but of opportunity, a convergence between available space and traits that align with the conditions now present. With many former competitors removed, the pressure to compete for established roles is reduced, allowing these organisms to expand gradually into a wider range of ecological positions. Their bodies reflect a set of adaptations that suit the changing world. Limbs positioned more directly beneath the body provide greater efficiency in movement, allowing for sustained activity across varied terrain. This posture reduces the energy required for locomotion, offering an advantage in environments where resources may still be unevenly distributed. Their skeletal structure supports this mode of movement, balancing strength with flexibility, enabling both speed and endurance. Respiratory systems also contribute to their effectiveness. The ability to process oxygen efficiently supports higher levels of activity, allowing these animals to move, hunt, and explore with consistency. In a world where environmental conditions continue to fluctuate, this capacity for sustained function becomes a defining feature. It allows them to occupy spaces that demand both mobility and resilience, linking their physiology directly to their success. Reproductive strategies further support their expansion. Eggs that can be laid on land, protected by shells that reduce dependence on water, allow for broader distribution across different environments. This independence from aquatic settings enables them to establish populations in areas that would have been inaccessible to earlier forms, extending their reach across the recovering landscape. The lack of dominant competitors plays a central role in their rise. With many specialized species no longer present, the niches that remain are less tightly defined, allowing for greater flexibility in how they are occupied. Early dinosaurs are not confined to narrow roles, but can adapt to a range of conditions, gradually refining their forms as ecosystems continue to rebuild. This adaptability allows them to persist through ongoing changes, establishing a presence that becomes more pronounced over time. As they spread, interactions within ecosystems begin to take on new patterns. Herbivorous forms feed on the recovering plant life, while carnivorous species develop methods of predation suited to the available prey. These relationships form the basis of new food chains, reintroducing layers of interaction that had been reduced. The process remains gradual, with complexity increasing as more species emerge and establish themselves within the system. In this unfolding, the rise of dinosaurs is not an isolated event, but part of a broader reorganization of life. Their success reflects the alignment of opportunity, adaptation, and timing, where the conditions of the world and the traits of the organisms converge in a way that allows for expansion. Within the quieter spaces left by earlier loss, they move steadily into prominence, not by displacing what remains, but by filling what had been left behind, shaping the direction of life as it continues to evolve. Stone carries the memory of forms that no longer move, preserving their outlines in a medium that changes more slowly than life itself, holding details that remain long after the organisms have vanished. Within these layers, the presence of earlier creatures endures not as living continuity, but as impressions, fragments, and traces that allow their structures to be seen, studied, and gradually understood. Fossils become the only remaining record of many of these forms, capturing moments that would otherwise be lost entirely. These preserved remains do more than mark existence. They reveal patterns of structure that echo into later life. The arrangement of limbs, the segmentation of bodies, the positioning of sensory organs all appear in early forms that do not persist, yet their underlying principles continue in modified ways. Certain body plans, once expressed in unfamiliar configurations, leave behind frameworks that later organisms refine, adapt, and carry forward. What appears to be entirely new in later periods often reflects adjustments to patterns that first emerged in these earlier, now vanished creatures. The process is not a direct continuation of specific species, but a transmission of possibilities. Structures that proved functional within one context become the basis for variation in another, reshaped by different conditions and pressures. The jointed limbs of early arthropods, the bilateral symmetry that organizes movement, the development of sensory systems that orient organisms within their environment, all contribute to a shared foundation that extends across time. These features do not belong to a single lineage, but arise repeatedly, shaped by the conditions that favor their persistence. In this way, the creatures that disappeared still influence the forms that follow, not through direct descent, but through the pathways they helped establish. Their existence expands the range of biological design, demonstrating configurations that, even if they do not continue, inform the limits and possibilities of future evolution. Each structure, preserved in stone, represents a solution to a set of challenges, a way of interacting with the environment that contributes to the broader landscape of life's development. Some of these forms appear as distinct experiments, configurations that do not align with later patterns, suggesting that early life explored a wider range of possibilities than those that remain. These experiments are not failures in the moment they existed, but complete expressions adapted to their time. Their disappearance does not diminish their role, but highlights the selective nature of evolution, where only certain paths continue while others end, leaving behind records that show what once was possible. Fossils, in their stillness, allow these experiments to be revisited, providing insight into how life has changed over time. The textures of shells, the impressions of soft bodies, and the traces of movement across ancient surfaces all contribute to a record that extends beyond individual organisms. They reveal interactions, behaviors, and structures that together form a narrative of continuous adaptation and change. Within this record, the influence of lost creatures becomes part of the ongoing story, shaping the forms that emerge long after they have disappeared. Their presence, preserved in layers of stone, connects the present to a past that no longer exists in living form, yet remains embedded in the structure of life itself. Through these remnants, the legacy of early organisms persists, guiding the unfolding patterns of evolution in ways that continue to shape the diversity and complexity of the world that follows. Understanding in this part of Earth's history is shaped as much by what is missing as by what has been preserved, with knowledge forming in fragments that must be carefully assembled into a broader picture. The fossil record, though extensive, is not continuous, and between layers that hold clear impressions lie intervals where little or nothing has been preserved. These gaps do not represent an absence of life, but an absence of record, leaving entire stretches of time where the details of existence remain uncertain. Preservation itself is selective, favoring certain environments and body structures over others. Organisms with hard components, such as shells or exoskeletons, are more likely to leave behind traces, while softer forms often vanish without direct evidence. As a result, the picture that emerges is shaped by what could endure the conditions of fossilization, not necessarily by what was most abundant or influential at the time. This imbalance creates a record that is both revealing and incomplete, offering insight while withholding full clarity. Reconstruction of ancient organisms adds another layer of uncertainty. When fossils are found in isolation or as partial remains, scientists must interpret how these pieces fit together, drawing on comparisons with known forms and principles of anatomy. In some cases, Early interpretations have placed structures in positions that later discoveries would correct, showing how unfamiliar these organisms can be. As new specimens are uncovered, previous reconstructions are refined, sometimes altering the understanding of how these creatures moved, fed, or interacted with their environment. The process of discovery continues to reshape this understanding. Each new fossil adds information that can confirm, challenge, or expand what is known, revealing details that were previously hidden. Entire groups of organisms have been identified through such findings, showing that the diversity of early life may have been greater than currently recognized. These discoveries often emerge from locations where conditions favored preservation, suggesting that other environments, less conducive to fossilization, may have hosted forms that left little or no trace. Within this evolving picture, there remains the possibility of organisms that have not yet been found, species that existed but have left no recognizable record, or whose remains have yet to be uncovered. The absence of evidence does not confirm absence of existence, and the history of paleontology shows that new findings can significantly alter established views. As exploration continues, both through fieldwork and through new methods of analysis, the potential for further discovery remains open. Scientific understanding in this context is therefore dynamic, shaped by ongoing investigation rather than fixed conclusions. Interpretations are held with a degree of flexibility, allowing for revision as new information becomes available. This approach reflects the nature of the evidence itself, where each piece contributes to a larger framework that is continually being adjusted and refined. What emerges is a sense of continuity in the pursuit of knowledge, where the record of life is not fully complete, but gradually revealed through careful study and discovery. The gaps, uncertainties, and revisions are not limitations alone, but part of the process through which understanding deepens. In this way, the unknown remains an integral part of the narrative, guiding further exploration and ensuring that the story of these early worlds continues to unfold, layer by layer, within the enduring record of the Earth. Time gathers its meaning through what endures and what fades, and within that balance, the forms we have followed become more than isolated curiosities, settling instead into their place as essential passages in a longer, unfolding story. The creatures that once filled ancient oceans and early landscapes did not exist as brief anomalies, but as fully realized expressions of life, each shaped by the conditions of its moment and contributing to the broader structure that continues to evolve. Across these distant intervals, life does not move in a straight line, but through a pattern of emergence and disappearance, where complexity builds, shifts, and is sometimes reduced before rising again in new configurations. The world that exists now carries the imprint of these changes, not always in visible forms, but in the underlying structures that persist through variation. What remains today is connected to what came before, even when those earlier forms have left no direct descendants. The absence of these lost organisms does not erase their significance. Instead, it defines the boundaries within which later life develops, shaping the possibilities that remain open and those that have closed. Each vanished lineage narrows the path forward, while each surviving trait becomes a foundation upon which new forms can arise. In this way, the present is built not only from what survived, but also from what did not, the combination of both determining the direction of change. Within this perspective, the unfamiliar shapes and structures of early life take on a different role, no longer appearing as distant or disconnected, but as integral components of a continuous process. Their differences highlight the range of possibilities that life has explored, showing that the forms seen today represent only a portion of what has existed. The diversity of the past extends beyond what can be easily imagined, preserved in fragments that continue to inform how life is understood. As this journey settles, there is space to consider which of these forms felt the most distant from what is known, which ones seemed almost beyond recognition in their structure and behavior. Each viewer may hold a different image, a different moment that stands out, shaped by the details that linger after the passage through these earlier worlds. If this exploration has added something to your understanding, or simply provided a quiet space to reflect on how life has changed, you can leave a note about the creature that stayed with you the most. These reflections become part of the shared experience, extending the story beyond the moment of listening. And if you would like to continue moving through these calm explorations of deep time, you can support the channel with a like and a subscription, helping these stories continue to unfold. Each new journey builds upon the last, following the same steady rhythm, uncovering the patterns that shape the natural world, and returning again to the quiet unfolding of science, where even the most distant past remains connected to what exists today.